Hey, I'm Cameron, and I'm going to show you how to build a DIY concrete quarter pipe today. As with all things DIY, there's many ways to approach it. I'm going to show you what I think is a simple and cost-effective way utilizing recycled materials and, when not recycled, the cheapest possible materials. The key component, concrete, reinforced mesh or rebar. You need fill, which is the backbone of your concrete. Today we're going to use foam for fill. It's one option, but it doesn't last as long as using compacted non-organic material. This is what we have here is a bit of sand and gravel we'll mix together to make a bit of road base up, so I can just pack that down anywhere where the foam doesn't get to that 80mm ratio that we need. The formwork is going to be made from particle board today. Worth grabbing a stick of timber. That is for supporting your formwork, and then you can also cut a screed out of it. Saves you going to buy a metal screed just for your pour. And lastly, in the way of materials, we're going to be using RAPIDSET ARDIT, which can go down to a very thin amount without cracking and binds well with concrete. Yeah, there's a little range of tools here. Not all of them are completely essential. These are all our trowels, obviously, a bit of PPE, and then a few power tools. There's also a string line, which we'll be using to find our radius. The two big hand tools, you need a shovel for mixing. This is your SCREED, which you'll be running between your formwork. So for a nice approachable transition, I've decided to make the radius 300mm longer than the height of the ramp. So we've got a 1.2 meter high ramp here. So we're going to apply a 1.5 meter radius. This means that you need to add a little distance for where you screw your string in to where it'll start. So I've added just a little piece of recycled timber that's an extra 300mm. Screw in a point and tie your string off to there. Pull the string taut enough that it's not going to move, but not loose enough that it'll have any wobble as you pull it through. If you have a square, you can make sure that your starting point is perpendicular, otherwise it's pretty easy to eye it off. It's worth doing a couple test runs without actually laying the pencil down and just eyeing off where it's going to end up. This way you can make adjustments without having to remark the board a bunch of times. 9 times out of 10, a radius is going to be steeper in reality than it actually looks, so it's worth, I think, starting with something that looks a little bit more mellow than you think you might need. We're going to cut it out with a jigsaw, which is the ideal way to do it DIY style. Once you've cut one of your side profiles out, it's worth just tracing this for your second one. That way you know they're both going to be uniform. So just put that back down and trace back over the existing, and then cut another one out for the other side. So once you've cut your side profiles out, it's time to start bracing it all together. There's going to be a bit of payload on these, so you want them well braced. You can achieve this by cutting a 45-degree angle on either side of a few sticks of timber, make them a few various lengths, and then you can screw them in up top like that, and then put a bit of weight on them, a cinder block or a couple bricks, whatever you've got. And then down the bottom here, I've cut another piece of timber that's the exact distance between them, and I'm going to screw that in. The reason for this is the concrete will end on this side of this piece of timber. Partway through the form, we'll strip it out, and then we'll meet up to that with the RAPIDSET ARDIT. So this is just a barrier to keep the concrete in place. So once your side profiles are being cut, and you've got your braces in place, everything's supported and feeling nice and firm, you can go along and mark roughly where you want your concrete height to start and finish. So either using a square, or you can just use a tape measure, mark 80mm below the entire way, and you want your fill to come all the way up to that point, or as close to as possible. As stated earlier, ideally, you want your reinforced mesh or rebar to be a single piece large enough to span the entire obstacle. This will provide the most amount of strength for the concrete if it's a single piece. In this case though, we're using recycled materials, so I'm going to tie together a few pieces of mesh using tie wire. Once you've got your formwork in place and your fillers in place, you're going to use this guy. And by tapping between the squares a couple times and gradually moving your way across, it's going to create a flex and a bend across your mesh, and then check it against your transition. If it needs more, keep tapping them. If you've done too much, you can easily flip it over and tap the other sides and it'll flatten back out. All right, so since you saw last, I've finished the fill. That involved cutting those few large foam blocks up into step shapes. I then mixed the sand and bluestone to make a road base, placed that around and compacted it to fill a few more of the spots. Just to keep it all in place, I thought I'd do what's called a blinding layer, which is just to mix up a bit of concrete, no steel, and just throw it loosely over just to get your heights as close as possible. So once you finish bending and cutting your steel to the shape of your ramp, it should look like a pretty similar skeleton to what your ramp's gonna look like. So you just wanna drop it in place over the top of your fill. So once your mesh is in, you wanna just check your heights, make sure that nothing is coming up above your concrete surface level, make sure your steel's all the right height. So you take your screed that spans between both side forms, and you just want to slowly drag that up. You can do this with a measuring tape, checking periodically, seeing how shallow the steel is. So far we're looking pretty good here. The steel maybe could go a touch lower, so I might need to tap it down in places. Today we are lucky enough to have a concrete mixer, but it's a luxury you can't always rely on. For price, accessibility, it's just not always an option. So I'm going to show you the fundamentals of mixing concrete in a bucket. I like to start with water in the bucket first and then your concrete. This way you don't have concrete just sticking immediately to the bottom of the bucket as you add your water on top. It's important to constantly get underneath it because the concrete's going to want to collect and sink, so make sure you're not left with dry pockets at the bottom by constantly getting underneath, flipping it and bringing it over. You want your concrete to look, when it's ready to throw on the ramp, a little almost rocky and like undermixed, but then as soon as you hit it with the backside of the shovel and give it a wipe, it'll start to form some sort of shape and you'll see it'll get smooth and flat. So once you've started to get pretty close to having your concrete approximately to height of your side forms, you want to take the piece of wood that you've selected for your screed. For an appropriate screed, you want to make sure that it's long enough that it can easily span between your side forms with enough space that you can move it side to side. You also want to double check by looking down the length of it that it's nice and straight. There's a few things to keep in mind with screeding. Don't drag straight down because you'll rip the concrete out. What it takes is a constant side to side motion as you slowly move down the ramp. This will knock the high points off while also working the high points into the low points. This will also give you a good guide, so you can see here, we're hitting level, this is good. Everything else is too low. So all this excess that we're going to knock down to the ground, we're going to be throwing that back up into the low points. Generally, you want to do a couple screeds. Each time you get it, you're going to be getting a better shape. As you screed upwards, you'll be filling holes, and as you screed downwards, you'll be cutting high points. So once you've started to get a pretty good shape from your screed, obviously up here is going to need a bit more cutting back, but because that's on a more of a vertical angle, the moisture's making it want to fall out. So we're going to leave this alone for a bit, let it harden, come back to it later, and probably screed it once more just to get this nice sharp shape on the top. But for now that it's like down the bottom, it's starting to firm up a bit. You know, it's not as wet as it obviously was when it first went in. So you can go to your first troweling stage or floating. This is a plastic and wood composite that I've wrapped with fiberglass, but you can just use a plain hardwood float, is fine. Make sure that you keep your trowel facing parallel with the toes of the ramp, because if you hold it this way, obviously being a straight trowel on a curved surface, you're just going to dig in. So with it facing this way, you have the option to go up and down and side to side, as well as on a sweeping angle. So at this stage, what you're trying to achieve is you're closing up some of these holes here. So you've got your shape, the shape is fine, it just needs to be smoothed off a bit, and this is the first stage of that. Because this is your first pass, you want to go pretty lightly, don't apply too much pressure. Pretty much just using the weight of the trowel itself, and you're going to guide it up and back, and as you'll see, it'll start to smooth it off a bit and close the holes. You want to keep the trowel flat, not on its edge, and you're looking for an orange peel type finish. Now you're not trying to get it perfect first pass. Again, if you touch it too much too early, you're just gonna make it wet. You're gonna make things take longer for yourself. It's gonna slump. It's just a world of problems. So this is already an improvement. I'd almost take that as a first pass. Maybe try and clean these up a bit if they're not too close to the slump area. As you're going, you want to be feeling for bumps. So I can feel here, it's starting to push out a bit. So that needs to be cut, either with the screed or with the trowel. So once you've done a couple passes with the wood float, just making sure that you've closed all the holes. If you have a magnesium trowel, or you can buy one, it does help. The magnesium, the way it reacts with the concrete is it makes the moisture come to the surface and it sinks the aggregate or the stones further down to get them away from the surface because you want it nice and smooth. So same with the wood float, you treat it the exact same way of just running it up and down. Not applying too much pressure at first, maybe slightly more than the wood float, because at this point the concrete is hardened a bit, so you can apply a bit more pressure as you go. Varies quite a lot, depending on what the conditions are, on how long you're waiting between passes, depending on outside temperature, how wet the concrete is. Typically, it's about 45 minutes between each pass. It's time to move on to a steel trowel. Get a pull trowel if you can. They're rounded at both ends, which means that it won't drag through the concrete. If you can get a small flexible one, this also helps because you can pull what are called arcs through your concrete, which is the best way, I think, to get a nice finish on your transition. Non-essential trowel you can get is an edger. So what that'll do is, if you run that up and down the edge of your concrete along your formwork, where you're gonna take the form away, that'll create a nice rounded off edge rather than being a sharp edge. Because we can't achieve an 80 mil coverage of concrete at this point, we're gonna use RAPIDSET ARDIT today. So what we'll be doing is unscrewing this piece of timber along the bottom and pulling it away carefully, mixing up a few buckets of that, and troweling that straight into the ground. You've got to let it dry for a little bit. You can kind of have one pass initially and then a second pass about 20 minutes later before you start polishing the toe of the RAPIDSET ARDIT. Make sure every time before you hit it that you completely clean your trowel, because this stuff tends to stick to itself and it will accumulate. So you'll have to clean your trowel and then you'll get one pass and then you'll have to clean your trowel again. Eventually, as it hardens, you can hit it with a steel trowel and polish it up the same as you will with the concrete. So this is a pretty true representation of a DIY quarter pipe. It's nowhere near perfect, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Generally, you want to wait at least 48 hours for your concrete to set before skating it, at least. If you've got an exposed hard edge like this, where you're actually going to be grinding the concrete, I mean, ideally you'd wait 28 days, but that's pretty unrealistic usually. So at least try and give it like up to a week. We'll be back in a couple of days to skate it and see how it goes. This is our final product, our concrete DIY quarter pipe. A little rough around the edges, as all DIYs should be. Despite a few lumps and bumps here and there, it skates like any other DIY quarter pipe. It's got a lot of character. Good luck with your own ventures. If you want any advice, feel free to hit me up. I'm always fielding questions anyway. It all starts from somewhere, so just start mixing some concrete and make a spot. Thank you for tuning in.